The first two videos are there, and all the rest of the videos, including today's, will continue to be there anytime you want to go back and check those out. We are here today with another guest. So welcome in, Tessa.
Hi, how's it going?
Great. Tell us a little bit about you and your role and what you're up to.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Tessa Rogers. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Harm Reduction Project Manager with Peers Alliance. So what Peers Alliance is a nonprofit that it covers the entire island. We are a sex-positive, queer-friendly harm reduction organization. So my work specifically falls into the harm reduction world. So my day kind of consists of everything under that field, whether it's training folks in naloxone or managing like our safer consumption materials, doing education sessions, engaging with people who use drugs or people who have used drugs in the past to get their inputs on different programs that we offer. So we're quite busy in that front.
Yeah, thank you for that summary. I think there's a theme there of sort of the term you hear, grassroots, right?
Yeah.
Very person-centered, very connecting with people on a level that's sometimes peer-based, but more of that equality approach.
Yeah, 100%. We try to be as low barrier as possible. We really believe in meeting people where they are at, and that is often not the same point where service providers want them to be. So we act as kind of a bridge between that and seeing what services exist for the people and how we might help them navigate those services. And if the service doesn't exist or they're not accessing the service if it does, kind of getting to that root cause of what is preventing them from obtaining those services and what can we do to help.
For sure. So I think that's a really in-depth description of kind of what's going on, what you're up to. I also think you've kind of touched on this in some ways already off the top, which is kind of nice. But let's sort of start from ground zero, if you will, of our theme of harm reduction and restorative justice, which certainly fits under the harm reduction umbrella. When we think of harm reduction, I think there's a lot of different interpretations, definitions, myths that maybe we can get to later. But what comes to mind for you is some of the sort of core parts of that, or like a bit of a definition, if you will?
Yeah, 100%. So I think you're right. Harm reduction has really become this taboo subject that everyone's been talking about, but nobody's really been on the same page. So harm reduction at its forefront is anything you do to reduce the potential negative impacts or risks associated with an activity or behavior. Is oftentimes those proactive measures that you can do beforehand, and really how we look out for one another and how we take care of ourselves. So in the substance use world, it's really an acknowledgement that people are going to engage in risk behavior and consume substances, and we can find ways to reduce risks associated with that substance consumption. So it is everything from policies and programs and to practices that aim to reduce the health, social, and economic consequences of substance use, and really a space for empowerment. So really allowing folks to identify what their principles are, what the potential risks are, and what are some tools that they either have in their toolbox or they want in their toolbox to put them in the direction that they want. And it really goes on some core principles. So I'll run them off and we can go more in depth if we want, but really focusing on health and dignity of the individual. It's participant centered. So really, like you said, that participant being in that driver's seat, participant involvement. So along the entire process, the participant is the one who's involved. We're collaborating with them. But it is their choices that we're following. And also any harm reduction program we have had input and ongoing input from our participants who are using them. It's about autonomy. Everybody has a right to do what they want with their body, and we value that. Recognizing equalities and injustices. So people are complex individuals with complex backgrounds, and there can be a multitude of reasons people use drugs. And it's also practical and realistic. So it doesn't just dismiss the harms that can come along with substance use. It doesn't aim to minimize those very real concerns that can exist. but a way to empower people to make the best decisions that they can with the most information possible.
Nice. It was a jam-packed piece of, of conversation there. I feel like there are a ton of ways we can go with this, and there's a lot of information that I think we can pull apart bit by bit as we kind of sit here and continue to go back and forth. So thanks for sharing that bunch with us. I think that's very informative. One of the things that I like that you talked about in terms of when there's like reducing the harm is the obvious version of it. But it goes beyond that, and it goes into that empowerment piece. And I think that that's one of the pieces that sometimes gets confused with sort of this empowerment versus enabling kind of conversation. And so I wonder if we can just spend a minute on that piece of what we mean when we say empowerment, and when we sort of highlighted some of the things that encompasses around choice and autonomy and power and control. And
yeah, 100%. And I think like, I'm glad that you mentioned enabling, because I think that is one of those common myths where it's like, well, harm reduction is just enabling. And in reality, the only thing harm reduction is enabling is someone to stay alive and minimize their health concerns and those risks. We believe in accountability. So it's not saying that someone can just do whatever they want because they're using substances. Like, we still believe in accountability, but we also believe that there's a multitude of reasons people use substances, and there's a multitude of substances out there. A lot of us, I've said it before and I'll say it again, a lot of us are dependent on something of some sort, whether it is, marijuana to go to sleep at night, whether it's caffeine to wake up in the morning, or if some folks shopping is a crutch. We all have something, and it's just the stigma that often comes with substance use. Substances are really morally neutral. Like, drug use itself is morally neutral, and oftentimes what people are talking about when they're talking about problems with it is the behaviors that result of some folks consuming substances. And oftentimes that's not the only thing that's going on. There are those root causes that are coming up, whether it's undiagnosed and untreated mental illness, whether it's physical illness, whether it's lack of sleep, lack of access to food and housing, if they've had no emotional support growing up and that's how they know to act when they need assistance. Like, there's such a plethora of things that I think oftentimes just kind of get bottlenecked, I'll say, into substance use. And that's what kind of causes this false narrative of enabling. But what we've seen historically is people are going to engage with this behavior regardless. If we don't give someone a new sterile syringe, they're going to sharpen their syringe and they're going to inject again. And what might happen is they might either collapse their vein, or they might share with a friend, increasing those risks of Hep C and HIV and other STBBIs. So really what it's doing is trying to give people the information of, yes, this might make you feel good, and it also might affect you in X, Y, and Z, and there might become social risks and housing risks and employment risks that come with this. It's not about minimizing those harms. When we're talking to people, it's really about, this is the reality you might face. And if you're choosing to consume substances, or you have to consume substances because you're dependent on them, how can we meet you where you're at to make this safer? What are your priorities? What are your goals? What do you want to accomplish? And it really goes into those effects of an idea like housing first. Like, if somebody has a house, if somebody has access to nutrition, well, they're able to really divert some of that energy to things that they might think are more beneficial for them than, the grind of trying to consume substances to stay awake on the streets so they don't get mugged or assaulted. There's just so much complexity behind it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think one of the biggest sort of misconceptions that folks have is that harm reduction is in competition with abstinence or other sort of ways of dealing with a behavior or a situation. when in reality, harm reduction is often for a lot of those folks part of that path
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
an option among those, right? And so it's not uncommon for someone to approach something from a harm reduction lens of right now, this is the best I can do with the resources and information I have in my situation. However, long term, I'd actually like there to be a day when I'm not involved in this behavior in any capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like how you said that because that's exactly what it is. It's really about, yes, we long term envision with participants and create plans, and we still need to get through tomorrow.
Right.
So, how can we provide things that can make it less risky tomorrow while we work on those long term plans? And for some, like you said, some that is sobriety, some it is, I just want to consume at night to go to sleep. Some folks, it's I just want to be able to have a beer with my friends on the weekend. Like you said, it's not harm reduction isn't working against abstinence. It's not working against any of these things. It's really a part of it. Like I think we need to look at abstinence, harm reduction, and treatment all in a circle that complement each other, and especially when it comes to things like substances, because I might have a dependence on cocaine, but I'm completely fine to consume marijuana. So maybe I want to focus on my cocaine right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like to kind of think of it as like a menu, right? Like someone can come to a service provider, whether it be substance use or other behaviors, which we'll sort of delve into, some of which you've already highlighted for us. But someone can come and they can say, hey, here's kind of a menu of options. And what do you think works for you based on where you're at today?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that maybe that analogy might be helpful in some ways, because I think another piece of this is that folks aren't always in the same space with the same goals on a day-to-day basis. So sort of how like we might have a preference when we go to order from a restaurant, they're not always going to order the same thing. Sometimes we're going to be in a space where we're not as committed or interested in one pathway as we were a different day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like harm reduction is meant to be flexible. I think oftentimes when we get into some of the more structured programs, it's there's hard black and white lines. There's hard areas of what you can and what you can't do. And oftentimes if you engage in something you can't do, you're out of the program and you're back to square one. So harm reduction is really flexible in the sense that the participant is the driver. If you say to me tomorrow, hey, I want to talk to an addictions counselor, I will support you in that. And if you don't show up for that appointment, we'll schedule another one.
Mm-hmm.
And we will do that until you are ready, if you become ready. And if you don't, again, I'm just happy you walk through that door, and let's work on what other things are your priorities right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a good way of looking at it, is like, what can we do for you in lieu of this other thing that maybe is not the right time or you're not able to manage at this moment. You sort of touched on the variety of reasons as to why somebody may not be in a position or a space to be able to pursue those types of options. And so being able to say, okay, that might not work for you. What would work for you? And I think one of the things I'll sort of say is like a tagline to people when I start to think about like, treatment planning and working with folks and looking at measuring sticks, is like, if you can reframe sort of success as progress, this work in general can become a lot easier.
Yeah, I remember I did an interview not too long ago, and somebody said, like, how many quote unquote successes would you say you have? And I was like, I would say every single one of our participants is a success. The way we have a relationship with them, the way that they're willing to show up time and time again, every time someone walks through that door or calls one of our street outreach workers, like that to me is a success. They're engaging in a service that can assist them. They are motivated. They're still alive, hopefully, doing okay. So like you said, like to me, every day that happens is a success. I think too often we view it as like what the traditional productive member of society is. But in reality, Like, I wouldn't say I'm productive 18 hours of the day, like
Right.
by no means. And also productive towards what?
Yeah.
So I think it really is about those individualized goals.
Yeah, it can become very binary of someone's either successful or failing, and that really takes out a lot of room in the middle of those two pieces of the spectrum, if you will. And so that kind of gray area in between there is progress, right?
Yeah.
And that's the journey that everybody takes on their way to whatever goals happen to be standing there in front of them. And so having that opportunity to say, hey, look what you've done relative to where you were when we previously talked, that sort of embodies that client-centered empowerment pieces of harm reduction.
Absolutely. Celebrating that growth, whatever it may be.
Right. So let's go to sort of some of the other things and how harm reduction has evolved from substance use, because I think that's kind of the first thing that pops into people's head when they hear harm reduction is, oh, substance use, right? So it's like, instead of using cocaine, I'm going to use cannabis. Instead of drinking daily, I'm going to drink every other day. And,
Yeah.
Instead of using a route such as intravenous, I'm going to smoke or snort or consume it orally, right? So those are all like sort of your prototypical examples, if you will. And I think that while there's value to that it's helpful to go beyond that and make sure that there's an understanding that these types of ways of working with folks goes into other sectors and other behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is, like you said, it is such broad reaching, and folks oftentimes don't realize how much of their day they subconsciously spend planning to reduce some of those harms in their lives. It often is kind of that voice in the back of your head telling you what you can do safer, or it might honestly be on autopilot. One of the examples I often think of is walking your friend home. Like, if it's a busy night in town, Saturday night, people are all around and they live downtown, maybe you're walking them home. Maybe you are someone who puts on your seatbelt. Hopefully you are. That has become a law, but that is reducing those risks. You think of even speed limits, like those are ways to reduce those harms. We think of bicycle helmets. We even think of things like the housing first model, where we're really trying to give people wraparound supports. I think, yeah, it's honestly just about everywhere in our lives, even when we think of like the poisonous, hazardous materials logos that are on cleaning supplies. All of those, I would say, are harm reduction efforts.
Yeah, I think those are some great examples, many of which sort of encompass like a safety perspective. And even in addition to those, I think there's some very practical examples, like somebody evaluates their nutrition situation and says, hey, I'm eating out or consuming a certain type of food that I wish I was consuming less of. In that journey to go from consuming that at X number of times or X amount to something less than that, as an example as well of harm reduction, right?
100%. And if you once we look at things like that, it's even, budgeting for the month to make sure you're going to have money to pay your rent, so you don't risk your housing stability.
Sure.
All of these things play a part in arguably most of our day-to-day lives, and we just don't name it as reducing harm.
Right. Yeah, because I guess the sort of opposite, if you would, of reducing harm would be increasing benefit, right? Like, not the opposite, but the other way to look at it if you reframed it. And so you could sort of argue that on a day-to-day basis, most people are interested in increasing the benefits in their life, or increasing the positive aspects of their life, right? I do something, I enjoy it, I'd like to do that more. I eat something, I enjoyed it, I'd like to do that more, right? So that sort of drives us in terms of how we make some of our decisions. And so reducing harm is sort of a way of reducing some of the negative consequences, like you talked about at the beginning, or negative impacts that we might have, to leave room then for more of those positive things in our lives.
100%. Yeah. And I think it really comes down to that motivational system we all have inside of us, in the gratitude system. And how we can really honor those.
Yeah. So let's dig into a couple examples that are sort of relative to the field, as they are things that we've alluded to over the first couple of days and we'll be getting to. So you brought up housing first, which I think is an interesting one to start out with. Let's chat about that for a minute and just kind of introduce, what does that mean? I can certainly add some context as to kind of where that comes from, or we can talk about that in terms of some examples or what that means in terms of principles. But let's go there for a minute. I'll open it up to you first to kind of anything you want to share in terms of housing first.
Yeah, so housing first to me is really focusing on, as silly as it is to say it because it's in the name, getting the individual house first.
Right.
So providing folks a sense of stability and a place where they can just exist often goes a long way before we can get to kind of some of those root causes. Historically, a lot of ideas were that you needed to be sober to have housing. You needed to have a job to have housing. You needed to be med compliant to have housing, and all of these other things. When in reality, sometimes it's just the opposite, and somebody needs a place to live before they can work on any of the other things, because it's really hard to stay on a medication regimen if you don't have somewhere to store your medication. It's really hard to get a job if you don't have an address or somewhere to shower or somewhere to sleep. If you're not able to, sleep regularly, how are you waking up and being quote unquote productive for your day? Kind of all of those aspects are really getting someone in a stable environment first, so then they can identify some of those working goals moving forward and giving them those wraparound supports to move through that journey, whether that is connections to employment or whether that is financial connections for the time being or access to the food bank, and then preparing them with the daily living skills needed to independently live. So working with someone to, budget for the month, like we were saying, or meal plan, or connect them to the library to start applying for jobs online. That's really what it means to me.
Yeah. I think we're very much in alignment with sort of how we view it. I think what you outlined in terms of this shift in thinking from somebody has to demonstrate a level of stability or readiness to earn housing was sort of the viewpoint. People may not have used that term, but that's kind of what they were implying as part of this eligibility criteria and process, right? And so we've since come to recognize that expecting people's wellness and level of independence to improve in other life areas while they're in survival mode on a day-to-day basis, experiencing homelessness, is really setting people up to be in a tough spot.
Absolutely. I even think I actually used to work in housing first. And I even think of with participants, one of the biggest things was time. Nobody had a way to see what time it is unless they were estimating by the sun. Nobody had a way to follow up with appointments because they didn't know what time it was. And when they were finally able to sleep, they were often, oversleeping it, or there was no way of getting transportation because they weren't in one place. So even a service provider couldn't necessarily arrange that transport, because if you didn't know where someone was, you couldn't get a hold of them. How do you get them from point A to point B? So I think we take for granted something like looking at a clock, and that is something that folks who are often sleeping rough or in that survival mode really don't have.
Right. Yeah. And it's like you said, it's really hard to be compliant and actively participating in other forms of support when you don't have that stability and that safe place to start the day from, which is why this housing first, philosophy has taken off and has been accepted pretty much nationally at this point, and provincially, locally, as the gold standard when it comes to housing, because we see, and the other thing sort of part and parcel to that is that the research shows that once somebody gets housed, that has a positive effect at the other areas of their life organically.
100%.
Even without pointed intervention, right?
Yeah. We often see less activity in survival crimes. So we see less activity in people like squatting or trespassing in others' property because now they have a place to go.
Right.
We see less public drug use because if they are someone who's consuming substances, now they can do it in their own space. We see less public urination even, and like really involvement with that justice system because they're able to just exist somewhere.
Yeah, and it's that basic need, right?
Mhm.
And even now we're finally sort of framing homelessness as a human right, as kind of a movement amongst Canada and sort of provincially as well, of recognizing like it's not a privilege to be housed. It's actually a human right that, you know, we all should have the opportunity to start our day somewhere where we're properly habited and have some level of safety.
Mhm.
Okay, so housing first, one major aspect, huge component of certainly the work that we're all doing here on the island, and coordinated access and lots of things that bring us all together in terms of the work and support we're offering. Let's start to move into some of the other aspects of this. We'll start to touch on restorative justice a little bit and how that kind of fits into this. Why don't we start a little bit with what this idea of restorative justice is, and then we can kind of go from there into some of the details and principles and stuff.
Yeah, so I think restorative justice at its kind of core is that crimes are a violation of people, relationships, and their communities. It really focuses on restoring the losses suffered by those who were harmed and focuses on the accountability and holding those accountable of those who caused harm. Its principles are really, similar, kind of similar to harm reduction when,
Yes.
We're victim-centered, responsive, empowerment, recognition, inclusivity, forward focus, and collaborative. So kind of just offering those up, but really like looking into what those means. So from the person who has been harmed, oftentimes it can be validating. It can be empowering and really a part of healing to be able to talk about what happened to them and what that meant to them and how it impacted them, rather than looking at something like, how did this person break the law?
Right.
What was the crime against the law, rather than that person, and really helps individuals who have been harmed have a sense of stability and safety and justice be restored.
Yeah, I think like you touched on at the beginning and sort of outlined, it goes beyond this. You have violated the criminal act, therefore you will incur punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of the like very basic version of the law. And so we're looking beyond that to say, well, rather than just look at, okay, violation equals X punishment, how can we look at repairing and more going into that impact, right?
Yeah.
So what was the impact of that crime, either to the victim, either to the community as a whole, or to an organization, and not just saying, well, okay, if we punish someone, they'll hopefully not reoffend again because of the punishment, which is a whole nother conversation. But to say, okay, well, what was that impact, and how can we try to work through that impact in a way that this person could positively reintegrate into their community and their social circle when their consequence or punishment is over.
Yeah, I think that's huge, because I think that also opens up the door and kind of the conversation for people are more than just their behaviors. People, you could do something bad and that doesn't mean you're bad. Like their restorative justice really opens up that opportunity to go beyond, like you said, that typical punishment lens, and really get to the what caused this to happen. What led to this? Why was this something you did? And if we think of instances where there's like domestic violence, it's something to kind of get into those root causes of the why to prevent it from happening again. Because oftentimes when we see people being punished, if it's just punishment, it's not really oftentimes a deterrent to doing it again because we're not equipping them with any skills or education or emotional regulation supports that didn't exist before that caused them to offend in the first place. So I think it's really an ability to allow folks who have caused harms to be humanized, really, and call them in to ways that they can grow and ways that we can work together to say, like, hey, that wasn't okay. Here's what it did to the person. And what do we need to not do that again?
Yeah. And I like that you brought that up because you touched on that earlier when you talked about harm reduction. And I was going to pull it out, but it wasn't the right moment. And so it came back now. So it's meant to be, if you will. But you talked about separating the behavior from the person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a key component of kind of any of the work that we do, but is definitely atop the focus when we're looking at harm reduction and restorative justice. And I think it's common. You see that a lot as parents or guardians or friends, family, acquaintances, whatever it might be, working with, interacting with kids, right?
Yeah.
A lot of this, like, they drew on the wall, they spilled something, they broke something, there's 100 different
They bit a
things,
kid.
right? They could do anything on a daily basis, right? School, home, or otherwise. And that separation between, well, their action was poor or bad or whatever kind of language you want to use was not in compliance with what would be acceptable. But that doesn't define them as a child or as a human.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's like a great example because we're not just going to now, quote unquote, write that kid off and be like, you are a doomed case. You're just going to write on walls for the rest of your life. I know that's, a little bit more of a silly example, but we're able to really work with that child and say, like, hey, this is not okay. Here's why. Here's how it impacted me. And maybe here are some alternative methods to get your feelings out.
Yeah.
So I think, it is really powerful when we're able to see a person and see a behavior and identify the behavior as the problem and not the person.
Right. Yeah. And as you sort of alluded to, come in with this inquisitive, curious approach, right? Which is very motivational interviewing lens and fits perfectly with harm reduction and restorative justice. But this, okay, what's going on for this person? And that's really kind of on some of the underpinnings of restorative justice is looking at, well, what happened and why, and what's going on in this person's life. And that leads to things like, okay, what kind of supports could we set up and what kind of areas of life might they need some support with? And we're seeing that as, reducing the rate of recidivism being a key focus federally and provincially. And that's some of the things you're seeing is around housing and support for mental health and support for substance use and programs to connect people with their family and maintain those social supports. And there's that shift in recognizing as part of the justice system that simply incurring a punishment and then putting somebody back into the lifestyle or life that they were a part of previously is unlikely to change their future behaviors.
Yeah, people often default to what they've known, whether that is positive or negative, and whether that has a quote unquote good influence or bad influence on them. People will really default to that. So I think it really, restorative justice also allows us to kind of be practical and have meaningful intervention and prevention techniques. So I'm thinking even like healthy relationship educations.
Right.
Like those are things that can be so valuable in the long run. And often things like that, when we're investing in those prevention techniques, we're seeing those outcomes. We're preventing some of those harms because people have the education, they have the dialogue, they have had this skill set developed.
Yeah, we're trying to focus on how do we help that person and how do we improve their quality of life and get them onto a path that's more aligned with their goals. And will, as a byproduct and direct effect of that, often reduce their likeliness of reoffending or being involved in that.
Yeah, and I think it's creating those healthier communities, really. Oftentimes what we see is people who there's a saying that it's hurt people hurt people. And I
Right.
think that really kind of speaks to what we see, and especially when we look at folks involved with the justice system. It's often repeating what they've known, whether that is something they engaged with, whether it's something their friends did or their parents did. It's really, either whether it's seeking attention in the ways they know and asking for help the ways they know, or if it's, this is how someone showed love to me. And this was, my parents showed love to me by putting their hands on me and maybe abusing me. So this is what I associate now with love.
Right.
And if nobody has intervened, how do we expect that person to know any different?
Right. Yeah. Information, education, life skills, all of those things are a component of helping that person and giving them the opportunity to then make different decisions in the future because they're more well equipped.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on the person who has been harmed side, it often gives them a voice.
Yes.
Like oftentimes once things get into the judicial process, we hear that people no longer feel like they're involved. People feel like they no longer have a voice. They feel as if the path has already been determined and what they want out of this income doesn't necessarily matter. So if we even think of things like testifying, sometimes that can be very challenging on someone who's experienced harm.
Mm.
And sometimes it then is an expectation and a requirement of them,
Right.
even if they no longer want to move forward with that process. So I think it really gives them a voice and allows them to identify that path of healing.
Yeah. And goes back to that empowerment piece that you were touched on earlier, and we've talked about in different ways of that victim can be a part of the process in a different way, where there's scheduled safe meetings or safe interactions or opportunities to interact with that offender in a way that it's controlled, it's safe, it's on their terms, they have the power, they can dictate how that goes.
And they can have questions answered, which I think is a really big thing. I think oftentimes people who have been harmed have this thought of like, why me?
Yeah.
Why did this happen? Did, if they had a relationship before, did this relationship mean nothing to you?
Right.
Is there something I could have done differently? Like, did I put myself in this situation? All of these are things that I think often run through the minds of people who have been harmed. So that it's an opportunity to kind of ask those questions and put their minds to ease sometimes in that way.
For sure. I think we've done a pretty good job of breaking that down and covering some of the things there. We'll have some more information on our website after this when we list all the different resources about restorative justice and where you can find the supports and information on that here locally on PEI. We do also have a domestic violence therapeutic court that's come into place. It's just quite new. So I think that's another exciting development here as we look to things like therapeutic courts, which are, again, kind of fit under that umbrella of harm reduction and restorative justice, right?
Yeah, I think it's a super exciting thing to see that is developing because it's more options.
Yes.
It's more options, right? So really focusing on, again, that behavior is the problem and not the person. And the person who had harm, they don't always have to be just the victim. They are also a person who has a life outside of that harm and can still in the future.
Yeah. And the nice part about the therapeutic courts is that, as the word implies, there's a therapeutic lens to it, right? It's not just punitive or justice focused. There is that going beyond that behavior into that person to try to give them access to a variety of different supports from different areas of life that they can have along that journey while they're part of the criminal justice system. Right?
Yeah, and I think something worth noting with that is part of the criteria and eligibility, which I'm sure folks will see on your website, is also the fact that people have to take, like, the person who caused harm must take responsibility in order to meet that program's needs. It's
Yes.
it's not a, I'm just going to say, oh, I did that and get off scotch-free. There's way more to it.
Yes. Yeah. Like you said, there'll be more details, but that is a good thing to highlight, is that to be a part of that process, there's a accountability, responsibility piece.
100%.
All right. So we've covered harm reduction. We've covered restorative justice. We're moving to the end of our time here as we move to wrap up. Anything that's still sort of floating around in your head that you want to share or express as we move to the end of our conversation here?
I think there's so much and
Yes.
not enough time. But really just like, if anyone is interested in engaging in those conversations and really kind of getting deep to what is harm reduction and how do I encounter that in my life? How do I ensure that I'm not enabling someone rather than, just supporting them? All of those conversations, like, we're always willing to have and always willing to kind of explore those and provide resources and whatnot. It is a very complex topic that we've kind of tried to cover, or complex topics, I should say, we've covered in these 40 minutes. But I don't have anything pressing, I don't think.
Okay. Yeah, I think you summed it up well. I think just this idea of remaining open-minded to it would be sort of my hopeful takeaway for folks. And that piece that we sort of clarified around harm reduction doesn't mean abstinence is out of the picture. It's just meeting someone where they're at the moment.
Yeah, and still, if you are a community member who's having some problems or some challenges, and let's say it's like drug paraphernalia, for example, nobody wants to just dismiss your experience. We will engage with those conversations and we will brainstorm together, like, what can we do to, again, reduce some of those harms and reduce, syringes in communities and these different things. Because, like I said, we're not looking to minimize or just dismiss that there are behaviors that are not ideal, sometimes associated with that substance use. But harm reduction is also such a valuable resource, and everyone deserves to be able to, wake up tomorrow morning.
Yeah. Anything peer specific that you want to throw out there in terms of information, or how to find you guys, or what kind of work you're up to? Or
Yeah, I think we often have a lot of projects on the go. Our most recent and current one is we're in the process of launching a more robust drug checking service. So that will be very nice. So people will be able to know what is in their substance. That is an ongoing thing. So there will be more on that to come. But for really any up-to-date information on our programs, or to contact me specifically, or receive any naloxone kits or anything like that, all of it's on our website. So peersalliance.ca. In the Meet the Team area, there's all of our contacts. And we're easy to reach: email, text, call, kind of whatever you need. And then we'll go from there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. We will be back again tomorrow with day 4. We will have Ray Sharon from Salvation Army and Ashley Gillis, the Provincial Housing Navigator, to come on and talk about coordinated access and coordinated access programs. Again, you can find these videos on the John Howard Society of PEI YouTube channel. And thank you again, Tessa, for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.